Here we go, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to this wonderful panel. Thank you especially for Anthony for running over from your media appearance. Really appreciate that. Right, hello, I am Lynsey. I'm the Senior Climate Programme Manager here at the Conservative Environment Network. If you don't already know, the Conservative Environment Network is the independent forum for Conservatives in the UK and around the world who support net zero, nature restoration and resource security. Today we are talking about private finance. So this is the can we rely on private finance to build a resilient net zero future? Hopefully we're going to hear some fascinating subjects, I'm sure, from our panellists. We're going to be talking about the growth opportunity of net zero, and it will require a lot of investment, but hopefully we're going to draw out some solutions on how private finance can do the heavy lifting for this. Estimates suggest that this needs to reach £50 billion per year, stretching across all sectors, including housing, energy, nature-based solutions and transport. Private finance should be able to deliver much of this investment, but how can the government create demand for financial products that might be able to help us get there? Are government targets enough to draw investment to the UK? And how can our individual savings, pensions and insurance policies help us to reach net zero? What can all of us be doing on a daily basis to get to net zero? So as I said, we have got an incredible lineup of speakers with us today. We have Josh Buckland here to my right. He's a partner at Flint Global and was a former advisor to two Bays, Secretaries of State. We have Anthony Browne, MP for South Cambridgeshire and chair of the 1922 Treasury Committee. We have Sarah Gordon, visiting professor in practice at the LSE's Grantham Institute, and we have Charlotte Clark, Director of Regulation at the Association of British Insurers, who are kindly supporting us with this event. So the format of this event will start with a few opening remarks from each of our speakers, and then we'll go over to a Q&A from the audience. So please do start thinking about some of your questions already. Think about some of the opening remarks that we've got from speakers and find some juicy subjects within those. Ask some good questions. So we're first going to go over to Anthony, but are you recovered from your sprint across the conference centre? We'll go over to Anthony first for some opening remarks.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Lynsey, and thank you, Sen, for putting on this very important discussion. So the role of private finance in getting to net zero is absolutely critical. I mean, clearly government needs to do its part as well, but we won't get there with the new technologies, new sources of energy, without private industry backing it and investing in it. And the really big example, which I'm sure everyone in the room knows, is wind power. That actually we've now about 40% of our electricity is generated by wind power. That's basically pretty much that all built by private companies that have been investing in it, and it's been growing very rapidly. It's going to carry on growing very rapidly. We've got a target to triple it over the coming decades to help get to net zero. And the reason the companies were prepared to invest in this wind power was because of the contracts for differences, the certainty of having income over a period of time, 10 or 15 years, which meant they were prepared to put their own money in building out the wind turbines, but also developing new ones. So I did a tour recently of a wind farm off the south coast of England, off Brighton, and the energy company there were doing spending a lot of their money researching floating wind turbines, because they're running out of shallow water to put wind turbines in, and they saw a big return on it. They could make the economics stack up. It was worth them investing in that. And without that, I just cannot see any way that a government would actually spend the billions of pounds needed, and you'd get the innovation needed and the being able to scale it in quite the same way. And then you look at other areas. You look at the government's obviously pushing on the small modular reactors, nuclear reactors that are being financed by industry. And again, I think that they will need contractual certainty for that to make it worth their while investing in it and building it out. And again, it's something that governments generally have proved themselves not to be very effective at doing. You look at carbon capture and storage. And again, the companies that are looking at developing those technologies already exist. I know there's quite a lot done in Norway, the Sleipner Reserve and so on. But actually, the companies developing carbon capture and storage, they want contractual certainty. It's their business model. They want to know how much money they can make over 10 years, 15 years or so on, and then they will invest the many billions of pounds needed. So they need, we basically won't get these new technologies without that the certainty from government, and certainly government won't be as effective in investing in these new technologies. And then there's the demand side, as it were, things like electric vehicles. I don't think anyone's really suggesting that government should be investing in developing electric vehicles. The companies will do that. They're all the major motor companies are doing it and getting there really quite quickly, and they're doing that because the government's urging them to. We might have extended the deadline for the ban on petrol and diesel cars, but clearly there's still the zero emission vehicle mandate there. 80% of cars sold in the UK will be electric only by 2030, and that creates a huge incentive for the private companies to invest. And again, I just can't see any way that using public sector money would reach that level of investment. But the other side of this is obviously actually the supply of money, and we do have in the UK, we're fortunate enough to have the second biggest pension assets in the world. I think it's about £2 trillion, and the downside, though, there is that they're separated up into, I think it's 27,000 different pension funds that aren't very efficient at allocating their resources to what would actually be the best investments. And I think there's a strong case for more consolidation, and also I don't think actually need to change regulation. I've done a lot of work with the Treasury on this. I think actually the regulations there also almost need us to change in culture in some of the pension companies to use that pension money to invest in long-term green projects and infrastructure projects. And that's certainly what pension funds in Australia and Canada most famously are doing. And I think we can get there, and the government is definitely pushing in that direction. But that would help provide some of the private finance that we need to invest in all those new technologies that I was talking about. So to summarise, I think private finance is absolutely essential in getting to net zero. We won't get to net zero without it, but it does require government providing the sticks and the carrots to make it worthwhile and give companies the certainty they need to invest in those new technologies.
That's great. Sarah, we'll come over to you next. I wonder if you've got any thoughts about the scale of the challenge and whether or not we're kind of on track to meet that.
Well, clearly not, sadly, at the moment. But I suppose one of the things that I find frustrating as a relative outsider to the political debate is the failure of all politicians to grasp the full growth opportunities that net zero presents. And I think it's not just the fact that if we don't address net zero, economic growth is going to be severely impacted, and pretty soon, frankly. It's that the real opportunities for Britain to become a leader in green growth, in green technologies, in climate finance are so huge, and yet we still have politicians of all colours suggesting that somehow net zero is anti-growth. I think and there's a huge number of people in the private sector, particularly in the city, in financial services, who really already grasp the opportunities that net zero, so not just climate, but also environmentally friendly investment present. So what is actually needed for government to up its ambition around this? I've been leading some work at the London School of Economics around blended finance, around the way that public and private capital can work much more effectively together to deliver outcomes, frankly, not just for net zero, I mean across a whole range of other public policy priorities. But we all know that the UK we have to get our investment rates up again. They're chronically low. They've been chronically low for years. They're chronically low against our peers. And where I would somewhat disagree with Anthony is I think that there's what tends to happen, particularly in conservative circles, is the perception that if the market can solve it, the market should be allowed to solve it on its own. And that simply isn't going to happen when it comes to investing for net zero. There are some really critical things that government does need to do to get that private money going to the outcomes that we're all seeking. So I think that change in mindset, Anthony, that you referred to within the pension funds, I think it's also something that needs to happen within government and within government departments, within local authorities as well. Working effectively in models where you use public finance, or the public sector has a role in catalysing private sector investment, requires real collaboration. Requires collaboration with investors, it requires collaboration with investee companies. And I think there are some really fantastic models of what can now be replicated at scale to get those private finance flows really going into these climate and environmental outcomes. There's one, I hope they're coming up and speaking here as well, but there's a very good recent example from the Green Finance Institute, which is working on a battery investment facility where we all know the UK could theoretically be a leader in batteries. We're really falling behind at the moment, but it's somewhere where we have got a certain number of comparative advantages. But designing the investment vehicles to meet that need, they require collaboration and co-design right from the outset between government, between investors, between investee companies, to really work out what is the most effective investment vehicle, the most effective funding mechanism that would really unleash the potential of that sector. The report on my work that's going to be published later this month is really showcasing a whole range of these type of examples of these blended finance models that can now be rolled out, replicated. But as I say, it does require a change in approach and a change right from the outset. Just one very quick final point on the regulatory side. The real key is to issue new guidance on fiduciary duty. Fiduciary duty, as most of you will doubtless be aware, is the duty that if I look after your money, I have the duty to look after your money properly and responsibly. And for the vast majority of pension fund trustees, that has come to mean seeking the best financial return rather than taking into a broader set of social or economic factors around those investment choices. We can perhaps dig into that in more detail in Q&A, but I've taken up more than my 3 minutes.
You've highlighted some really interesting areas that I hope we do come back to. So would welcome lots of questions on what we've heard so far, particularly public versus private finance. That'd be really interesting to get into. Next, I'm going to turn to Josh.
Thanks, Lynsey. And just to pick up on the point Sarah made, I think it's a fair challenge that politicians haven't necessarily seen the economic growth opportunities in the full scale from the net zero agenda, and actually in some ways the Labour Party have started to put it as central to their economic mission, so it maybe shows that situation is starting to change. I think though with Labour they've maybe potentially gotten onto the wrong idea around public finance being a driver of that, and you've started to see them unwind that decision. Miliband committed to £28 billion a year of public investment, and they're slowly realising that both that doesn't reflect the scale of the net zero challenge. No one's quite sure what the cost profile of net zero will be, how challenging the transition will be, but ultimately everyone agrees that you cannot just simply rely on public investment, and it simply won't be enough from a scalability perspective. Critically as well, the thing which private finance has been very good in the infrastructure sectors at doing is working a way where you can spread the cost of what is a very capital intensive upfront cost transition. The net zero transition will require an awful lot of things to be built, both in the UK and abroad, which maintain and enable the low carbon transition to take hold across all sectors. And the idea that you could simply rely on current taxpayers or current bill payers to make that transition happen doesn't seem to me at least feasible. And having been in government for a long time, the critical thing about relying on public finance is there are always other priorities, whether it's the NHS, whether it's schools, and ultimately private investment and making the most of that opportunity gives you the role where actually you can rely on a sustainable flow of finance over a long period of time, which is what we ultimately need. How do we best kind of attract it into the kind of challenge of the panel to how we best unlock private finance at scale? I think the PM was right, kind of, when was it, 10 days or so ago, to call out the fact we need a more honest debate on net zero and we need to be realistic about how the transition is going to work. The challenge is, he said, we don't have the right plan, I'm going to come up with a better plan, but then didn't set out what that plan would actually be that puts consumers more at the heart of the transition. And at least in the work we do with businesses, what is critical is not having a very granular plan between what's going to happen now and between now and 2050. It's not realistic. No one's calling on the government to do that. But it is critical to know what is going to happen in the next 5 to 10. And that's where the uncertainty that's created in the announcements 10 days ago puts the business community on the back foot, because ultimately there were a set of commitments that were certain and are no longer so. So I think the critical thing and the challenge the PM has now set, the new Secretary of State and the new government, is to think quite carefully about what that more granular plan can look like and how it will unlock private finance in the near term. I know we'll get to this in the Q&A, but 3 quick things that kind of I'd want that plan to include. Firstly, a point that Anthony made, long-term frameworks. The UK is excellent at long-term financing frameworks, whether it's on renewables, whether it's in regulatory models, and those can be extended to other sectors, and critically, they also drive large-scale infrastructure investment rather than small-scale, and that's ultimately what we need to see. Secondly, what's evidently clear from what the PM said a couple of weeks ago is that we cannot just rely on regulatory levers. We need to think about the tax system and how that incentivises the net zero transition. We need to think about how we work across just subsidy as well as broader structural change. And that means all parts of government need to think quite carefully about the contribution they make, whether that's DEFRA on natural capital, whether that's the Treasury when it comes to climate disclosures. All of the broad levers of government and its ability to work together is absolutely vital. It can't simply rely on the energy department to make progress. And then finally, something that you alluded to, Sarah, actually, transparency. The markets are the best judge as to whether you're taking a climate resilient pathway as an investor. And ultimately, the more we can do around climate disclosures, moving those out into other areas like nature-based disclosures as well, the more chance that the market can hold businesses to account to what they're doing, and by proxy, businesses can put pressure on the government to act with more clarity moving forward.
Great to hear some concrete steps on what you'd like to see happen next. Charlotte, finally over to you.
Thanks. I guess listening to the other panellists, it feels like we're in kind of violent agreement.
It's not good.
No, I think it's a good thing. I mean, it would be a rare person who thought that either the public sector or the private sector could somehow bear the costs of transition, or that one of them was the perfect answer. I guess, the challenge is really how do you bring that collaboration together, and what is the role of government, and therefore what is the role of the private sector? As Anthony mentioned, at the ABI, where we kind of represent most of the pension long-term savings in the country, I don't have it at 2 trillion. I think it's closer to 3 trillion. So we have this great kind of asset that we can use. Yes, pensions regulation and other things are very complicated, but ultimately, it's about taking the opportunities that are there. I don't know of any long-term savings provider that isn't either desperate to kind of invest more into net zero, or desperate to have that certainty around that investment. I guess one of the things, the reasons why people come back to pensions time and time again, is if you've got a long-term problem, you kind of need a long-term solution. And pensions is really just about, it's not about investing for the next 2 or 3 or 4 years, it's about investing for the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years. So we're not looking for very high returns, but we are looking for long-term returns. We're looking for solid returns over a very long period, because those are the liabilities that we're trying to match. So, you could see why pension funds are so interested, and you can see why governments are interested in why pension funds can be part of the solution to this. As we've been doing some regulatory change post-Brexit, one of the things that has changed is there's a new solvency. Trust me, I'm not going to talk to you about that.
Solvency too. We love Solvency too.
But, from that, the industry's committed 100 billion for the next 10 years. And largely, we refer to green and good kind of projects, 100 billion for green and good projects. So that can be housing, can be retrofitting, but, energy networks, energy generation, wind, particularly floating wind, and where what's the right kind of financial instrument there. And as Sarah said, this collaboration of really trying to understand what are the right financing models for each of these, that takes quite a lot of thought, and it takes a lot of kind of serious people in a room to kind of think it through. These are quite complicated areas, trying to bring together insurance, pensions regulation with kind of investment in infrastructure and energy. But I don't think it's beyond the wit of us to be able to do that. I don't think it's just a question of, well, where's the money coming from? It is, how do you build the system to allow that money to be unleashed to the right things?
Goodness, an easy task by the sounds of it. Okay, I'm going to use Chair's prerogative to throw a question over, but while I do that, please get thinking about your questions. We will have a SEND member of team with the roving mic, so we will try and take as many questions as we possibly can. But I wonder, Charlotte, if I could kind of throw it back over to you straight away. I'd like to think I'm an environmentally conscious person, but I honestly, I don't know what to do with my savings. I don't know how to use my pension in the best way. I don't know if there's a good insurer that might be able to help me with some of my insurance
some
needs.
in the room that I'm sure they'll make themselves known.
But I'm genuinely curious, what can we each be doing with our own money to help the environment?
I mean, I think it would certainly be rare that if you were with a pension fund that didn't have a sustainable investment option. But increasingly, given that, I can't think of any major pension provider, a long-term savings provider that isn't committed to net zero targets in 2040 or 2050. So that's not their sustainable fund. That's them as an organisation. So yes, of course they will have very specific kind of funds, but across the board, most of them are committed to this is their transition plan. This is their way to ensure that they are contributing to the net zero targets. So I mean. Transition plans are not legally required yet, are they? I think they're coming probably over the next year or so. But quite a few people have got them on their websites already. I would have a look at those and see what they look like. I won't say who I think is kind of ahead of the game here, but I think most people are taking it incredibly seriously. It would be rare, it seems to me, for a pension fund, an insurer in particular. I mean, I haven't worked in insurance very long. I've only worked in it 3 years. The thing that really kind of surprised me, and it should not have done, is insurers take climate change really seriously because they pay the cost of it. They're right at the forefront in terms of what is the cost of some of these events. So their interest in doing it, you could say, is a bit self-interested, but ultimately, if it works, then all to the good, really.
Fantastic. Well, I know what I need to go home and do. We are going to take some questions from the audience. So do we have a SEND member of staff who's got the roving mic from Steve? I think Katie's on it, Finn. Don't worry. Thank you for your enthusiasm, though. I'm going to take groups of 3 to try and get through as many as possible. As we started a few minutes late, please do try and keep your questions snappy and just say who you are and if you're representing a company or organisation. So we've got a few down the aisle, Katie, so I'll make your life a little bit easier. And if we take 3, find out. Yeah, there you go. There's 3 in a row there. Yeah.
Is that right? Yes. Amy Gray from BRE Group, which operates BREEAM, the world's leading sustainability standard for the certification of buildings, which we see investors increasingly using to prove that their built environment portfolio meets the standards they all want to achieve. But I'm also a party member in Cambridge and absolutely agree with Josh about the need for long-term frameworks. But realistically, we've got less than a year, probably 6 months until the next election. We haven't got time to implement long-term frameworks, but what can we put in the manifesto that will both make a difference and also be election winning?
That is fantastic. Just a short plug here. SEN will be putting together a SEN manifesto. So anyone in the room, please do throw us all your ideas. I would love to hear if you have some solutions to that. Anyway, yes, next question.
Hi, David from Rockwell, we're the UK's largest stone wool insulation manufacturer, and I was really taken with what Anthony said around long-term certainty around needing to invest. So I think in our industry, I think not just us, but I think every UK-based manufacturer is owned by an international group, so we have to convince them to put their money in here, and they could put it into France, Germany, wherever. And I think this kind of comes down to something that I was intrigued by what Josh said around the honest debate, which is absolutely true. We do kind of need it, but do we need to be careful that we don't undermine that certainty, which means that we can't get that investment in?
Wonderful. And there's a gentleman just a few rows behind you, if you don't mind.
Thank you. Graham Jones, Conservative member from Southport. Two questions. One, very quickly, we heard about the 1% from Liz Truss at the growth meeting an hour or so ago. What are China up to? Why should we, completely bankrupt ourselves when China is taking absolutely no steps, in my view, in this direction? And secondly, battery technology is light years away. I think we're completely deluding ourselves about the fact that we can get cars driven by batteries in the next 10 years.
Right, okay, we've got loads of interesting subjects there. So I'm going to throw it over to Anthony first. We're really interested to hear what you think about the manifesto, particularly with your work on the 1922 Treasury Committee there. And then I will come over to Sarah about long-term certainty and planning. And Josh, perhaps you could talk a little bit about the 1% battery technology. And Charlotte, I'll let you choose whichever subject you fancy. Anthony, over to you first.
Thank you, Lynsey. And I'm actually going to, before I come to my answers to questions, actually take up something that Sarah said and try and disprove her on something. Because she said politicians weren't positive about the opportunities in net zero. And it's true, I didn't address that in my comments at the beginning, but there are clearly massive opportunities with net zero. And there are enormous. And when I mentioned the wind industry, we're now the offshore wind, we're the biggest offshore wind producer in the world. We've got the 4 largest offshore wind farms, and that's a massive export industry. Actually, we now have expertise and capabilities that we're exporting around the world. Those are real jobs, high-paid jobs, engineering jobs, and so on. And clearly, making electric vehicles, again, huge economic opportunities with that, heat pumps and so on and so forth. We're on the brink, or going through a major energy and industrial transition, and that it clearly has challenges, but actually huge opportunities. And it's definitely in our national interest if the whole world is moving in that way, which I think it is to have first mover advantage, that actually you develop that expertise and those skills and so on, and you can then sell them to other countries that follow in your footsteps. So anyway, I hope that answers that point. I'm a politician being positive about the opportunities in net zero. What should we have in the manifesto? Oh, well, good question.
Very good question.
Your fundamental point was about the short-termism of politics and the sort of long-term agreements and contracts that business needs. And what I was going to say on that is that actually I think on a lot of this there is some cross-party agreement. So the actual contracts of differences, I think I'm right in saying, was initially set up by Labour, and it was very small scale at the time, and the Conservatives adopted it and carried it on, and actually it works really, really well, and it's now at a vastly different scale. And I think if we come up with similar contractual proposals for I mentioned carbon capture and storage, and I don't know what Labour are on small modular reactors, but I think if they are policies that make sense, I very much doubt that a change of government would lead to a fundamental change in policy. And having said that, I think long-term contracts are quite difficult to get into manifestos, I have to say. But anyway, I'll work with Sen and try and get that in there. I just wanted to address the one other point on China, which was raised, and it's true that the UK is 1% of. 1% less than 1% of the global population, 1% of emissions. And China has had it's enormous growth in emissions over the last 20, 30 years. I mean, just look at the figures of it. It is huge. But it's completely untrue to say that China's doing nothing, actually. They are investing a lot in solar power now, and indeed wind power. And I know actually some of the companies in Britain that have developed wind power are now selling their expertise to China to help them do offshore wind power. But the other thing is just climate change is happening. We have to tackle it. I think it's a real counsel of despair to say, well, other people aren't doing as much as us, therefore we shouldn't do anything. And I think international leadership does actually really, really matter. And we are, I'm obviously a supporter and member of SEN. I was also chair of the all-party parliamentary group on the environment, and I met a lot of other environmentally conscious MPs from other countries, and their question to me was always, how come the UK has done so well at cutting greenhouse gas emissions? And it is really important to have countries that are leading the way and showing how things can be done. And we're fortunate enough, and through government effort, but also the capabilities we have as a country to have been able to be at the cutting edge of certain things like offshore wind. And I think it's absolutely right that we carry on trying to do that global leadership. And the other thing, even if you're really sceptical about China and sceptical about the cost of net zero, coming back to my first point about the opportunities, that I am absolutely convinced that the world is moving in that direction. The whole world is decarbonising. We're in brink of a major technology transition, and even if you're sceptical about everything else, there's a definite advantage to being one of the first movers there, and it gives you opportunities you wouldn't have if you're trailing behind everyone else.
Absolutely agree on that front. And I look forward to working with you on the Sun Manifesto, Anthony. Sarah, over to you for some comments about the kind of long-term certainty issue that was raised.
Yes, I'm not sure I have much of value to say on the long-term certainty. I mean, it's absolutely imperative that the business has policy certainty for these long-term investment decisions, and we all know that. We've known it for years. It's absolutely staggering, the idea that any politician from any party should seek to destroy that kind of policy certainty around net zero, because it's clearly going to have an extremely negative effect. I mean, where I think that, there are some models from the past that really show us what that policy certainty could look like. And I think that speaks to Amy's question about what would be a vote-getting manifesto commitment. I mean, the reason that 40% of our energy is at times coming from renewables, coming from wind, is because of the Green Investment Bank. And the Green Investment Bank created a market in wind that didn't exist before, and it did that by cleverly using government money to crowd in multiples of private sector investment. And I think the manifesto commitment is that, to crowd in multiples, to use taxpayers' money more smartly. For every pound of taxpayers' money spent on green, to mobilise £4, £5, £6 of private sector investment that will not just go into creating markets and investing in sectors of the economy where it's badly needed, but will also critically up the UK's investment rate and its economic growth rate. And that's obviously the key. And just one final point on Graham's reflection on batteries. Batteries are not just about cars. I mean, a battery-driven car is not necessarily something that we want to aspire to, frankly, in environmental terms. But for renewable energy, the long-term requirements of renewable energy are the blocker at the moment is batteries. We need batteries to be able to store the energy so that we can use it at the time we actually need it. So just one small point on that. Thanks.
Wonderful. Josh, over to you for the next question. I believe it was on the 1% of emissions and battery technology, but feel free to pick up any of the other points.
Yeah, I might just touch on the manifesto one quickly. For me, no more bloody targets, as the PM said. Ultimately, there's enough targets across the climate agenda to kind of shake a stick out. What you need is delivery plans to getting there. The most important one is the 2035 power sector decarbonisation target. That enables you to then hopefully decarbonise the rest of the economy. And at the moment, there isn't a really credible plan beyond we'll build lots of renewables and nuclear. Where's the flexibility coming from? Where's the battery storage coming from? How do you sort out the grid infrastructure to support that target? Clarity around how that's going to be delivered, the how rather than the what, is absolutely vital, and that's something that hopefully this government will focus on. And obviously the Labour Party have got a 2030 target, so we'll see what they put in theirs. On China, I think I agree with what Anthony said. They are doing obviously a lot on the low carbon space, but what I think is right is we shouldn't be naive. Ultimately, we shouldn't decarbonise by simply exporting our own industry. The critical thing is to have a coherent economic and industrial policy whilst we decarbonise. So carbon border taxes, thinking about our own domestic carbon pricing, alignment with bodies and partners like the US and the EU who have similar climate policies and therefore are doing a similar industrial transition. That ensures that we aren't simply exporting our emissions elsewhere, and that would be a kind of travesty and ultimately wouldn't help the climate picture either. So I think it's a fair point, but we should obviously work with countries like China as well to ensure that we are acting collectively. And on the battery side, I think ultimately it's for kind of consumers and companies to work out whether they think the EVs themselves can stack up. The role of government actually is not to pick the technology, it's to make sure that the enabling infrastructure around charging is there, and that for me feels like it's going to be the big constraint. Manufacturers will see that they roll out a large number of EVs over the next 5 to 10 years, but is the charging infrastructure going to be there? And it's not just a national government issue, it's also a local government issue, it's a planning issue, and that feels to me like the thing in the next 3 to 5 years to get right, and then ultimately the technology can hopefully improve to match the level of demand you get as a result.
Great. Charlotte, finally, I wonder if there is one thing that the ABI would like to see from government in the next manifesto or beyond.
I think it is that certainty of we have lots and lots of goals, we have lots and lots of targets. that sense that when I speak to firms, that where is there a pipeline? Can we understand the pipeline? What is the plan over the next, not over the next 2 or 3 years, but over the next 5 or 10 years? And therefore, I can, with security, invest in those sorts of kind of timelines. And I think David's point is a good one of certainty versus honesty. One would hope that wasn't a trade-off between those two things. And you would hope that that actually you could get both, regardless of the political party, of this being led by the science, being led by the technology. Of course, things will change, but I think people are realistic enough to realise that actually we do need to make some investments. We do need to make some changes. That is not going to be costless, but it does come with opportunities as well.
Mm. Great, okay, we've got some time for some more questions. Where's the microphone? Wonderful. There's a gentleman at the back in the middle of the row, and then, Katie, I'm going to ask you to run to the front. There's a gentleman here. And there's someone maybe perhaps on the left-hand side, sat down.
George Hawley, I work for Zurich Insurance. The question I'd have is, we've spent a lot of time today talking about how we can transition energy to being more environmentally sustainable, but adaptation and nature resilience are also going to be key if we want to meet the UK carbon targets. And as an insurer, we are starting to look at how we can implement that. And so I suppose an open question to the panel is, any ideas on what insurers should be doing and investing in to achieve that?
Fantastic. Yeah, we love to hear about nature resilience as well. Katie, there's a lady sat down on the end.
Hi, Sarah Beamont. I'm head of energy transition for a investment bank, so I spend a lot of my time trying to get private capital into exactly the sectors you're talking about. And my question is really around the different forms of private and public capital that you're talking about, because it comes in different forms. And a lot of the comments are on pension funds, which are necessarily long-term investors. They're not going to fund energy transition, which is fundamentally a punt on which technology is going to be the right one, whether it's going to be hydrogen, whether it's going to be heat pumps. That's not their ballgame. And similarly, when you look at public capital, a lot of the comment is on things like the Green Investment Bank and the Green Infrastructure Bank, and they also follow what private markets are doing and what they're lending into. They're not moving the market. So my question is really about what are you doing to, or what can we do to reform the City of London and our sort of VC capital space to really invest in energy transition rather than renewables, which are pretty much a done deal at this point.
Great, and then there's a question down the front, Katie. Just a gentleman here on the left.
Thank you. I'm Mike Indian from Bupa. Just a plea to not forget the importance of population health within this. Obviously, we're talking about investment, long-term goals. We're not going to have this without a healthy workforce, and climate and environment are increasingly impacting the population's health. We see emissions linked to antimicrobial resistance. We've seen statistics from the ONS saying that heat-related deaths in this country, there's 50,000 of these over my lifetime. That could quintuple by 2050. So we're not going to get there. We're not going to get the investment. We will bankrupt ourselves as a country if we don't keep people healthy and working. And of course, crucially, the people who are most vulnerable to many of the effects of environment and climate change are older people who have been asked to work for longer. So if I could see one thing from the next government, it would be more of a recognition of the impact that is currently happening through our environmental issues, particularly in cities like London. If you are putting ULEZ in, it is going to help people live longer because it's going to mean less AMR. And it is also going to mean helping people who are going to be more vulnerable to health, and that's those with cardiovascular disease as well, who have to work longer to collect their pensions. So thank you.
Great. I think I'll choose to leave the ULEZ debate for this panel. That has already come up many other times. That's great, though. So nature resilience. Anthony, I wonder, particularly with your previous experience of being on the Environment APPG, what do you think about nature resilience, getting more funding into nature? And Josh, you mentioned earlier about natural capital markets, so maybe we could come to that next.
I'm going to do a rare thing for a politician to say, I don't know, but I'm all ears. Nature resilience is incredibly important, and I've done a lot on the promoting rewilding, for example, but also working with farmers to get more regenerative farming and increasing carbon contact of soil and so on. I've got a lot of great examples in my constituency, such as Wimpole Hall, which is National Trust, and the Hope Farm, which is the RSPB sort of showcase farm. How you get private finance into that is another question, though. I don't know quite how you do that. There must be ways of doing that. I would say on the Sarah's point about the getting different forms of money into climate change. It's a point very, very well made, and we sort of lumped it all together. And that there are some. I mean, you said renewables is a done deal. I mean, it's clearly a lot more mature as a technology, and it's a lot easier for pension funds to go into that space. I think venture capital moving into new technologies and getting more explorative. Maybe there are. I mean, one of the things the government has done is, or the Chancellor's announced, it's not yet enacted, but encouraging pension funds to put a small proportion of their investment into VC or startup funding, and that might help direct some money into green projects as well as other sorts of technology companies. And also just generally, I mean, at the moment we've got a pretty good tax regime for helping VC and EIS and so on. I think we definitely need to make sure we carry on that.
Great. Josh, I wonder if you have any answers to some of Anthony's questions around getting funding and financing into nature resilience.
Yeah, I think critically it's the value. Like ultimately people have seen the value creation around the climate agenda, both the valuing of carbon and through carbon taxation and also carbon pricing. People have realised there's actually a long-term revenue stream there. So the same thing needs to happen on the nature side. There's a lot of work the UK is actually leading on getting a better sense of the value of nature and then being able to use that as a long-term revenue stream. And the UK has the solidity and the financial markets to be able to do that. It needs to obviously be done in a robust way because you don't want companies buying up large areas of forest that they were never intending to cut down and pretending that that's a nature-related investment. The critical thing is you have a robust market, and ultimately then people are able to invest in the long term, potentially alongside obviously kind of philanthropy as well as also government money, because a lot of these things are going to be quasi-commercial for some long period of time. So the creation of market opportunities, the credit systems that are robust and transparent are absolutely vital. And also critically trying to tie up and learn from internationally. I was talking to an investor who works in China and Asia, and they're doing a lot of work on sustainable urban draining systems, something that we know we need in this country. And ultimately a lot of the world has experienced much more extreme weather than we have. We will start experiencing that more and more over the course of the next 20 years. So the more we can learn from countries around the world who have started to square this circle with both public and private money, the more we can learn. Just on the on the public and private markets and kind of the type of private investment question, I think, to be honest, the easier way to answer it is where the gap is. There's actually a huge amount of money at VC and startup level. There's also a lot of long-term infrastructure money. The gap, which is where I think the gap is for public investment, is around that commercialisation journey that the UK is not very good at. How do you take a small startup business and transform it into a multinational? That's where the public environment can actually play a catalysing role. And you're starting to see the investment bank obviously do that in the space of carbon capture. They'll do it in other areas as well. And that feels like the journey that the UK needs to go on. And maybe that's where if you have a kind of a spare pound of public investment, that's where you target it specifically. And then hopefully later down the line, the private markets can pick that up again.
Charlotte, on the kind of healthy workforce, I wonder, is there something that insurance firms are doing to strengthen supply chains and make sure that small businesses are reducing their carbon footprint as well? Is there something on the kind of supply chain angle that insurance firms are doing?
I mean, it's certainly part of it. So we have an industry climate roadmap. Part of that is how do we work through different supply chains? How do we make sure that our supply chains are more net zero? And part of that is also in terms of how do we ensure healthy workforces for our own businesses. So it's definitely part of the agenda. I just wanted to kind of also just raise George's comment about nature. We published earlier this year our Action for Nature for insurance. This is a hugely complex area. Whenever I get kind of a bit bored with climate change regulation, I start to think about how difficult nature regulation is going to be because it's so place-based, it's so specific, but at the same time, so many of the solutions that we need to find will be nature-based. And so really kind of understanding that and understanding how they can be invested in. And the real challenge there is really thinking about, well, where are the income streams from some of these investments? And just picking up Sarah's point, she's absolutely right. In terms of, all money is not equal. If you're investing an 80-year-old's pension in, venture capital kind of technology, you definitely are not following your fiduciary duty. If some of a 20-year-old's pension is invested in that, then that's probably kind of acceptable. But again, this is ultimately somebody's retirement. So, where we come in as institutional investments is very much in this kind of large amounts of capital to scale up things, these long-term investments on proven technologies. But that's about making the system work well, as Joss said. That we are quite good at that venture capital kind of innovation. It is that how do you very quickly make that kind of industrial level where the challenge is. And there's an awful lot of really good work, I think, by people like UKIB and others, really thinking through, well, how do you use public money in an effective way in order to do that, to crowd in as much private sector money as possible.
Sarah, finally, we heard from Sarah in the audience about the kind of different sectors and how they've responded, or private finance has responded to them. Have you got any examples of sectors that have done extremely well with leveraging private finance, or ones that are doing particularly poorly, and we should be thinking about how to get more private finance into them?
Yeah, I suppose I'd slightly challenge. I mean, Sarah, you're the investment banker, but I would slightly challenge the idea that it's difficult to attract VC or pension fund money into energy transition, and even in unproven markets, because we've got very good examples. So, I mean, Generation Investment Management, it's set up by Al Gore and David Blood, so beautifully called Blood and Gore. One of the most successful impact investors, one of the earliest impact investors, particularly in environment, has recently launched Just Climate, which is specifically looking at hard to abate sectors, so the really difficult bits of the energy transition. It's attracted, I think the number itself is commercially sensitive, so I'm not going to say it in this forum, but its first close was well into the billions. But the challenge with that is that it was not UK investors investing in it. It was international investors attracted to it, and the money is going out from, it's not in energy transition in the UK, it's energy transition, guess where, in places like the US. Because what you've got, and Josh, to your point about we should be aligning with the EU and the US on in certain aspects of policy, the problem is that the EU and the US are using blended finance to address the climate and nature crisis in a far more innovative way than the UK is at the moment. So the Inflation Reduction Act is dedicating $360 billion of tax credits and other subsidies to private business for the energy transition. So, of course, all the investment is being sucked into the US, and it's the same with the EU Green Deal and programs like EU Invest in the EU. So we need to catch up in the UK. We need to start this idea of using our money, the taxpayers' money, more smartly to crowd in that investment is something that's being actively tried and successfully tried in the US and the EU now. And I would just double down also on the point around fiduciary duty. Of course, we have to look after people's pensions properly. We all, hopefully, in this, most of us, at least in this room, I hope all of us will have a pension, and we want that money must, of course, be looked after responsibly. But the idea that you're investing for the long term but not taking climate into account is no longer financially feasible. But we have to address the elephant in the room with pension fund trustees, is that they are uncomfortable investing in this kind of stuff. They are uncomfortable investing in the energy transition. So what is needed to make them feel more comfortable? And that is far greater, stronger, careful guidance from government. This is the role of the regulator, to give pension fund trustees that certainty, that reassurance that if they are investing, yes, for financial return, but also for environmental outcomes, they're doing the right thing and they're not using our money irresponsibly.
Great. Okay, given we started a little bit late, I will take one further round of questions, but please keep it to one sentence, and I will then also ask the panellists to give it a snappy response so that we don't go too much over. We've got another panel at past. So we'll take a few one-sentence questions if we've still got the roving mic somewhere. Wonderful. Okay, gentleman in the aisle, gentleman over there as well, and that looks like it. Perfect. Was there one at the back as well?
Lovely, thank you. Harvey Chandler from the Global Infrastructure Investor Association. We represent some 1.6 trillion of assets under management across nearly 100 members, pension funds, insurers, and so on. I just want to pick up actually on Sarah's point around the Inflation Reduction Act.
Please make sure it's a question.
Oh, sorry, it is good.
Yep.
And GDIP. Is there any particular areas that any of the panellists think that the UK could really excel, be competitive in to challenge and ultimately draw that investment from the likes of the EU and the US? Thank you.
Fantastic. Love it. Succinct and snappy. Katie, gentleman standing up. If there, thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Mike Leonard from the Building Alliance. How do we stop the green industrial revolution becoming a China green industrial revolution? 45% of heat pumps coming from China, 95% of PV panels coming from China, batteries all coming from China. It looks like we've already lost that race.
Okay, there's one more right at the back.
Thanks. Mark Simmons from the British Ports Association. We're going to need around 10 new ports to support the energy transition. There's plenty of money around, but that investment doesn't have to come to the UK. So my question is, very quickly, what one thing can we do to make the UK more competitive and attractive to investment so that it comes here and it's not being built in the Netherlands or Norway?
Fantastic. I feel like there's a theme to these questions as well, which makes my job a lot easier. So if we could use these answers as closing remarks. So if there are any themes that you want to draw out from the conversation, please use these last few moments, panellists, to wrap up a little bit. I'll start with Sarah, if that's okay, and I'll work down the panel, finishing with Anthony. So Sarah, what are your thoughts on those questions there? There's a lot around supply chains, a lot around making sure the UK is competitive, and what one sector perhaps should we be focusing on?
Yeah, and I'll be quick. I've been on the China's already one point. I really don't think that's the case. I think we've got a strong track record in identifying sectors of the economy where we can be globally competitive and where careful, considered, thoughtful government policy can really get the capital, private capital flowing into them so that we can build our competitiveness against globally, not just against China. But we have to be careful and thoughtful about it. It's not a blanket, it can't be a blanket approach. The one thing I think that would make a difference is it actually comes back to, Lynsey, something you were saying at the beginning. I don't think it should be your responsibility to decide to try and navigate the world of where do my savings go, where do my investments go. We need to get to a place where pension funds, all pension funds in their default funds, have an allocation to climate and nature. And that should be our aim, rather than constantly exhorting individuals to change. It's about policy changes, and it's about financial services changes. I'll leave it at that.
Wonderful. Josh?
Yeah, very quickly, on the kind of one sector the UK could potentially lead in, I do think grid flexibility. We've got a shed load of intermittent renewables already built out in the UK. There's a huge opportunity for us to potentially utilise some of the British technology that's been developed around battery storage, long duration storage, the hydrogen storage piece, to try and show that we can lead a kind of heavy renewable electricity system and do it quicker and in a more deep way than other countries. On the China question, I think for me it comes back to this point around we shouldn't be naive, and ultimately if we can collaborate with other similar jurisdictions, have clear and robust supply chain requirements, that will give us the opportunity to compete at an international level in the areas that we care most about, alongside obviously being very cautious and thoughtful about exposed supply chains, particularly around critical minerals. And then just finally on the kind of how we make the UK attractive still, for me it comes down to the political consensus we've had on net zero for a long period of time. Ultimately that's been a real driver of long-term investment and the UK being an attractive destination. The fear is over the next 12 months the division that might be created on net zero undermines that. So the kind of message from me, from business to centre politicians, is maintain that political consensus, because that's the thing that does actually differentiate the UK to what we've seen in some areas of Europe, let alone obviously the US and elsewhere.
Fab. Charlotte?
Like you, I was kind of taken by the theme really of the last three questions, which it seems to be kind of in terms of competitiveness and UK competitiveness and the role of kind of business investment within that. and ensuring that business investment does quite a lot of the heavy lifting with regards to UK growth, UK competitiveness, and making sure that we have the right sort of frameworks here in the UK to be able to do that. You know, the green agenda, I think, just gives us a great opportunity, and it's about really, you know, it's not so much about, well, there's one industry out there. I mean, I think hopefully from the panel it's become clear that, you know, that there's lots of opportunities out there, but it's also how all of these things stack up together. You know, it's no good having the most, you know, generation of energy, of renewable energies, if we can't store it, if we haven't got the right networks to get it to the right sort of places. It's no good having electric vehicle cars if you haven't got a grid that allows you to charge them effectively. You know, so it is a bit more about making sure that we have these plans in place and making sure that there is consensus, and this isn't political football, but more one that allows people that consistency so that we can get the right investments into the right places.
And finally, Anthony.
Thank you. So on the first question, where we could get real advantage, I'd say two things. One is, I mentioned it earlier, floating wind power, that actually lots of other countries don't have the shallow seas that we have. They don't have as much space. You get it floating, then it gives you huge opportunities around the world to develop it. And because we have expertise in building floating rigs for oil exploration, that actually the expertise actually exists already. And then the second one is CCUS, which I mentioned before, but carbon capture and use and storage. Again, we've got huge opportunities there because we've got the oil and gas industry, but also we've got most of Europe's storage space for CCS, and we could definitely get an advantage there. I agree. I don't think China has cornered the market quite as much as was made out. We do need to be we don't need to be. We should make sure we're not naive about it, but we should ensure supply chain resilience. That's something we discovered was really important during the pandemic, and it was mentioned earlier. CBAM's carbon border adjustment mechanism, I think, is very, very important to make sure they don't take advantage of us. And then on the third question about, you know, what's one thing we could do to make sure we're really competitive. I'm just mentioning this because I hadn't mentioned it before, although in our answers lots of people did. Transmission grid. I know it's something that Rishi is very focused on as we electrify the economy, you know, cars and domestic heating and so on. That we're going to need to radically reform our transmission grid. It's not there. We need to increase capacity as well as things like the storage and flexibility that Josh mentioned. And if we get that in place, we'll be in a far better position for other forms of investment for this whole renewable, net zero economy that we're moving towards.
Great, loads to take away there, particularly interested in the manifesto asks, thank you. Next up, we have got a fantastic event called Turning the Tide on Plastic Pollution in Our Seas. We've also got a great campaign on protecting great British penguins. If you'd like to learn more, go see our stand in the exhibition hall. All that's left to say is thank you very much to the audience for your brilliant questions, and thank you to our speakers, Sarah, Josh, Charlotte and Anthony. Particular thanks to ABI for supporting this panel. Give a round of applause, please.